Photo Equipment, Part 4, Camera, Presentation for the Advisor, Revised 2025, July. Cameras is the fourth video in the equipment series. What we'll cover: brand selection, dSLR versus mirrorless, format, APS-C versus full frame, comparisons, recommendations, and a summary. Brand selection. My opinion. If you know a particular camera system, such as Nikon, then helping your staff is easier with the camera system that you do know than one that you do not know, such as Canon. If you have classes and organizations that can and do share equipment, such as yearbook, journalism, sports leadership, ASB, and others, then it makes sense to standardize on a common system, such as Canon. If you do not share equipment, then you can do your own thing. dSLR versus mirrorless. Recommendation: go mirrorless. dSLR cameras and lenses are getting harder to find as they are being discontinued, and the prices of mirrorless cameras are competitive with dSLRs. If you have budget limitations, go with used dSLRs. You will be good for 5 or more years. Because the dSLR model is likely out of production, you need to buy spare cameras, because if one of your cameras dies and needs to be replaced, you need to be able to find another one. It is getting harder to find dSLR lenses as the manufacturers discontinue them. Get your lenses as fast as you can. The problem has already hit. I've had to wait 6 months looking for a lens that has been discontinued. In one case, I had to settle for second choice because my first choice was just not available. Finally, expect to migrate and convert to mirrorless at some time in the future. Format: APS-C or full frame. There is no clear recommendation for mirrorless. At the present time, there is no clear best choice between APS-C and full frame. For APS-C cameras, Nikon is lagging in the APS-C line with only one camera, the Z50 Mark II. Canon, Fuji, and Sony have more APS-C cameras to choose from. There are some full-frame cameras that are similar or lower in price than the high-end APS-C cameras. So the question may become, why should I get an APS-C camera when I can get a full-frame camera? Lenses. Canon is still fleshing out their APS-C lenses. Third-party lens makers are still fleshing out their mirrorless lenses. They have a ways to go before they get to the point where they have all the lenses that they used to have with their dSLR lenses. You still need the full-frame f2.8 lenses for night games. There are no lower-cost APS-C equivalents. Well, there weren't any lower-cost APS-C equivalents for the dSLR lenses either. It is likely that APS-C will again be the choice, if and when the third-party lens makers fully shift to mirrorless cameras. Full-frame camera. There are some full-frame mirrorless cameras that are similar or lower in price than the high-end APS-C camera. So the question becomes, why should I buy an APS-C camera when I can get a full-frame camera for about the same price? Lenses. Canon has not opened the full-frame RF mount to third-party lens companies. This limits and complicates what lenses you can use, because the problem is the Canon RF lenses are quite expensive compared to third-party lenses. Third-party lens makers do not yet have a full line of mirrorless lenses for Canon and Nikon. For dSLR, The formal recommendation to go to APS-C is no longer clear. For APS-C cameras, you have limited selection. There are only 3 practical APS-C DSLR cameras, and 2 of them are more expensive than similar mirrorless cameras. So, why DSLR? Then there is no price advantage. Prices of full-frame DSLR cameras continue to drop into what used to be the APS-C pricing. So you can't say, I can't get a full frame because it's too expensive. Some of the full-frame cameras are down into the APS-C pricing. So again, why APS-C? Lenses. As DSLR lenses are discontinued, your only source for some of the APS-C lenses is the used market, or to use the more expensive full-frame lenses. Full-frame. Prices of full-frame cameras continue to drop into what used to be APS-C pricing. So, as above, why bother with an APS-C camera when I can get a full-frame camera for the same price? A negative is full-frame cameras are generally bigger and heavier than the APS-C camera. And when you've got small students, ounces count, and the full-frame camera may simply be too heavy for them. Caution. Camera caution. When you buy a camera, you have to read and understand the specs. One of the most important spec for sports and yearbook is to have a camera with a high maximum ISO level, ideally 25,600 or higher. The reason: many sports are played under low light conditions, such as outdoor field sports at night under lights and gym sports, and in the theater or performing arts center because it can be quite dim in there. Caution on Canon model name. The T7 is not a T7i. This subtle name difference has significant practical effect for sports and yearbook photography. For several yearbook advisors, and probably many more, have been confused by the similar names. The devil is in the details. You have to read and understand the specs. As on the previous screen, look at the high ISO numbers in this small table. T7, max high ISO, 6,400. T7i, 25,600. That is a significant difference. And in the case of my field, you could not use the T7 on the football field, or you would be restricted to between the 40-yard lines. As you get towards the end zone, it is just too dark for that camera. Next, frame rate. T7, 3 frames per second. T7i, 6 frames per second. So in summary, the T7 is a poor low-light camera, and 3 frames per second is quite low for sports. The T7 is a crippled T7i, and it's like going backwards to the old T5i. Note, the T7i has been replaced by the T8i, which in turn has been discontinued. Cameras and comparisons. Cameras available 2025 summer. APS-C, $1,000 and below. Canon, T7 and SL3 DSLRs. R100, R50, R10 mirrorless. Fuji, X-T30 Mark II. Nikon, D7500 DSLR. Z50 Mark II mirrorless. Sony, A6100 and A6400. In the $1,000 to $2,000 range, Canon 90D DSLR, R7 mirrorless, Fuji XS20, XT50, XT5, and XE5, Sony A6600 and A6700. Full frame $2,500 and below. Canon RP, R8, and R6 Mark II. Nikon D780 DSLR, Z5 Mark II and Z6 Mark III mirrorless. Sony A7C Mark II, A7 Mark III, and A7 Mark IV. Camera comparison notes. You have to understand the effect of the various items to your environment. It may be very relevant or it may not be relevant at all. And the various items are on the little snippet on the right side of the screen. For each camera, have a bunch of categories or items going down. Megapixels. For most purposes, 20 to 24 is all you need. If you have 40 megapixels, do you really need it? Probably not. Max ISO. This is very relevant for low light environments, gym, night sports, and the theater. You want at least 25,600 for these. However, it is not relevant if you only have day games. You're not going to be up at 16,000 ISO in the day. IBIS, in-body image stabilization. Important if the long lens does not have optical image stabilization. It is not important if the lens does have stabilization. So if your lens is stabilized, your body does not need to be stabilized. FPS with CAF. What that means is frames per second, frame rate, with continuous autofocus. This is important for sports. This is not important if your school does not have sports. Built-in flash. If the camera does not have a built-in flash and you need a flash, you're going to have to buy and use an external shoe flash. MSRP is list price. Be aware that many times you are not paying list price. Some cameras have significant discounts on the list price. So the list price is just a guide. Camera comparisons. APS-C DSLR. Summer of 2025. We have 4 DSLRs that we're going to be looking at. Canon T7, Canon SL3, Canon 90D, and the Nikon D7500. All 4 are DSLRs. Lens mount, Canon all have the same EF-S lens, and the Nikon's an F lens. Third line down, megapixels, we have a difference here. T7 is 24, SL3 is 24.1, 90D is 32.5. But do you need 32.5 megapixels? Generally, no. Nice to have, but you don't need it. Nikon, 20.9. Slightly low, but incomparable with the 24 megapixel cameras. Next item down. Here we have a problem. Canon T7, max base ISO 6400. That is definitely not high enough for use on our field at night. I am often at 16,000 to 20,000. And that 6400, even with extended at 12,800, just won't cut it. So it is not usable on our football field at night. The other cameras are fine. The D7500, base ISO 51,200. That's cool. Next item, IBIS. DSLR lenses do not have IBIS. So the fact that all 4 are no doesn't really matter because they're the same. No DSLR has IBIS. If you have stabilization, it is going to be in the lens. Next item down, FPS with CAF. The T7 is the slowest of the bunch at 3 frames per second. Tolerable, but given the situation where you've got faster frames per second with the other cameras, I would go with one of the other 3 for the faster frame rate. Next item down, built-in flash. Yes for all of them, which is good because if you get caught in a situation where it's dim, you can just press the button, pop the flash up, and keep going. Weight. The Canon 90D and the Nikon D7500 are the heaviest of the bunch at 25 and 23 ounces respectively. Bottom line, MSRP, T7 is the cheapest, and therein lies one of the problems. People will say, hey, it's a T7 and it's cheap, let's get it. But remember the previous slide when we talked about the T7 versus the T7i? This is where they get zinged. They think they're buying a T7i at this low price, but they're not. Most expensive cameras here, the 90D and the 7500. Camera comparisons, APS-C mirrorless, $1,000 and below. Cameras we're looking at, Canon R100, R50, Nikon Z50 Mark II, ZFC, Fuji X-T30 Mark II, Sony A6100 and A6400. Going down this list, megapixels of all the cameras are about the same. Max ISO is where we have a difference. Canon R100 and Fuji X-T30 Mark II both have a max base ISO of 12,800. The Canon maxes out at 25,600. The Fuji goes up to 51,200. However, here's the issue. On our field, 12,800 is just not high enough, and I do not know the quality of the extended ISO when you're pushing beyond your base ISO. So, it may be fine or it may not be fine. IBIS. All the cameras here do not have IBIS. However, like for the dSLRs, if your lens has optical image stabilization, the fact that your camera does not have IBIS does not matter. FPS with CAF. Frames per second with continuous autofocus for sports. Canon R100 is the lowest of the bunch at 3 frames per second. That's going to hurt sometimes. Fastest, the Nikon Z50 Mark II at 30 frames per second. Next item down, built-in flash. All have a flash except for the Nikon ZFC. At the bottom of the screen, MSRP. The R100 is the cheapest of the lot at $530. The most expensive would be the Nikon ZFC at $960. Camera comparisons, APS-C from $1,000 to $2,000. Cameras we're looking at, Canon R10, Canon R7, Fuji XS20, XT50, XT5, and XE5. Sony A6600 and A6700. Going down the chart, this time when we hit megapixels, we do have a difference. Canon R7, 32 megapixels. The Fuji XT50, XT5, and XE5 are 40 megapixels. However, the question is, do you actually need that much resolution or not? Next item down, max ISO. All the Fuji cameras have the same max ISO and extended ISO, 12,800 base and 51,200 extended. Just like on the previous screen, 12,800 is not high enough for our field, but I do not know the quality of the shooting at extended ISO. So it may be okay, it may not be okay. IBIS. All the cameras in this chart do have IBIS. FPS with CAF. Canon R7 is the fastest of the lot at 30 frames per second with the electronic shutter. built-in flash. The R10 has a flash. All the Fujis have flash. The R7 does not have a flash, and neither do the two Sonys. Weight. The R7 is the heaviest of the bunch by far. And price. The R10 is the cheapest, with the X-T5 and the X-T5 at the most expensive. Here we're going to be doing a comparison between the APS-C cameras, the 4 Canon cameras, the 2 Nikon cameras, 2 of the Fuji cameras, and the 4 Sony cameras. Cameras: Canon R100, R50, R10, and R7. Nikon Z50 Mark II, ZF-C. Fuji XS20, XT5. Sony A6100, 6400, 6600, and 6700. So going down the chart, the first place that we hit some difference is megapixels. Going across the chart, R7 at 32.5 megapixels and the Fuji X-T5 at 40. But like we said before, do you really need that much megapixels? In some cases, yes, but for the most part, no. Next item down. This area may be an issue. Max ISO. The R100 and the 2 Fuji cameras have a max base ISO of 12,800. That is not high enough for our field at night. But their extended ISO does get up high enough. Problem is, how is the quality of the extended ISO? I don't know, since I don't have one of those cameras. IBIS. Canon R10, R7, Fuji XS20, and Sony A6600 and 6700 have IBIS. But, like we said before, if the lens has optical image stabilization, then it doesn't matter that the body does not. But having an IBIS allows you to use a lens that does not have stabilization. FPS with CAF. Here the R100 is the problem at 3 frames per second. It is really the slowest of the bunch, because when you get up to the Canon R7, you're at 30 frames per second. Same with the Nikon Z50 Mark II, 30 frames per second. Built-in flash. Here we have a problem. Half of them do not have a flash. The R7, ZF-C, and Sony A66 and 6700s do not have a flash. That means if you're in a dark situation, you need to bring an external flash. You can't just press a button and pop up your flash. And that will crimp your style. There have been situations where I unexpectedly found myself in a dim situation, and being able to just pop up the flash is very helpful. Next item down, weight. Canon R7 is the heaviest of the bunch, followed by the Fuji X-T5. And finally, at the bottom, price. The cheapest of the lot is the Canon R100. The most expensive of the lot is the Fuji X-T5. Camera comparisons, full frame, $2,500 and below. Cameras are Canon RP, R8, R6 Mark II, Nikon D780, the only DSLR in the group, and the Z5 Mark II and the Z6 Mark III. Sony A7C Mark II, A7 Mark III, and the A7 Mark IV. Going down the chart, megapixels, that's where we see the first difference. Everybody is about the same in the 24-25 megapixel range, except for the Sony A7 Mark IV. That one has 33 megapixels. But as before, do you need that 33? Max ISO. All of them are more than sufficient, with the lowest being the RP at $40,000. The highest, the R8 and R6 Mark II at $102,400. IBIS. 3 of the cameras do not have IBIS for photography. The Canon RP, R8, and the Nikon D780. All the rest do have IBIS. FPS with continuous autofocus. Canon RP, the lowest of the bunch at 4. The fastest of the bunch is a Canon R8 at 40. Next in line is the Nikon Z5 Mark II with 30. Built-in flash. None of these cameras have a flash, so if you go into a dark situation, you're going to need to bring an external flash. Weight. The Nikon D780 is the heaviest of the bunch. MSRP. The Canon RP is the cheapest at $1,100, and the most expensive are the Nikon Z3 and the Sony A7 IV at $2,500. Purchase alternatives. Those without legacy gear, I recommend you go with a mirrorless camera. Those with legacy DSLR gear, you have 3 options. Stay with DSLR, stop buying DSLR and start a migration from DSLR to mirrorless, or start replacing your DSLRs with mirrorless. Eventually, you will have to go mirrorless. So you're not going to be able to stay DSLR for, let's say, longer than about 5 years or so. You eventually, as you start getting to a point when your DSLR gear is not supportable, you can't get lenses or you can't get replacement cameras, you're going to have to go mirrorless. So the recommendation, go mirrorless because there are currently only 2 viable production DSLRs below $1,000, and 2 is not a great situation to be choosing from. DSLR cameras and lenses are being discontinued and getting harder to find. I have had to go into the used market to buy cameras and lenses. If you currently have DSLR cameras, get a spare or 2 while you still can. As I mentioned before, if you need a repair and the repair ends up being the same price as a used camera, you might as well just buy a used camera and start planning your migration to mirrorless. Camera recommendations. This chart shows basically the cameras that we talked about and the recommended camera that is highlighted in bold. Mirrorless. Canon APS-C, R50, R10, R7. Recommend the R10. Full frame, R8, R6 Mark II. Recommend the R6 Mark II. Fuji, XT30 Mark II, XS20, XT50, XT5, and XE5. The sweet spot is the XT30 Mark II. Nikon, Z50 Mark II. Only 1 camera, so it is the recommended camera. Full frame, Z5 Mark II and the Z6 Mark III. Recommend the Z5 Mark II. The Mark II is significantly better than the old Z5. Sony A6400 and A6700. We recommend the A6400. Full frame, A7C Mark II, A7 Mark III, A7 Mark IV, and I recommend the A7 Mark III. DSLRs, you don't have much choice here. Canon SL3, Nikon D7500 APS-C, and the D780 full frame. Interestingly enough, there have been some sales on the D780 that have brought it significantly down in price, where it's challenging the APS-C cameras. The end. Please continue to Part 5, Sample Kits and Purchasing Plans. Please like and subscribe.